Hello everyone and welcome back to the pre-talk series. Today we are going to talk about the ethical cycle and we are going to explore a systematic approach to reaching a judgment that is more morally acceptable. However, before we begin, we need to recognize that in order to follow this ethical cycle, moral problems are messy and they have a complex process. When we are in a position of having to solve a structured moral problem, is because the problem is not clearly defined and we haven't formulated it well. Similarly though, as engineers would do, it's better to then follow the design process approach in which we understand that the brief lacks clarity, but by going through the process we start to formulate the problem a bit better. With that in mind, as I said, the ethical cycle will follow a similar approach as the design process. First, we are going to develop the moral statement. The first step of the ethical cycle is for the moral problem solver to formulate the moral problem. The moral problem has the characteristic that more than 2 or 3 values or norms, positive values or norms, have not been met. Therefore, one can consider it to be a moral problem. A moral dilemma would be when there are 2 possible solutions or less. The crucial part here is not the number of solutions, but the fact that either of them will not be satisfactory. In this case, you are doomed if you do, and you are doomed if you don't. However, most moral problems are not dilemmas, so we can continue using the terminology of moral problems. For a good moral problem statement, it is good to ask yourself 3 questions. What is the problem? Who has to act in this particular situation? And what is the moral nature of the problem? Now, once we define the moral statement, then we can proceed to the second step of the ethical cycle, which is to analyze the problem in terms of the stakeholders, their interests, their values, and facts. Stakeholders are important because on the one hand, they can influence the course of action, but also they could be stakeholders that are affected by the course of action. So now we have the problem statement. We have analyzed it in terms of the stakeholders. The third step now is identifying and devising options for action with help of strategies like the black and white strategy and the cooperation strategy. The black and white strategy is when you have just 2 courses of actions. You do something or you don't, effectively. But life is not that simple and that simplistic. So this particular strategy helps us to start formulating some ideas, but in reality what we are looking for is more courses of action to allow us to move forward. Often by generating more ideas, it helps us to go back to the moral statement and reformulate it so that it becomes clearer and clearer, just as we would do with a design process. Go back to the problem statement, to the brief, and make it clearer. The strategic operation not only seeks more than 2 courses of actions, but also courses of actions that are the result of the consultation that we have with the stakeholders. As we said, some stakeholders will be crucial in influencing our decision, but also they'll be affected by it, and therefore it's important that they are involved in this consultation. The next step of the ethical process is the evaluation of the ideas that we have generated in the previous steps. In this step, we'll look at various ethical frameworks to help us decide on which course of action is best. Now, if we remember, in the previous talk, we talked about various ethical frameworks like the utilitarianism, freedom principle, Kant's theory, and virtual ethics. Now, these ethical frameworks we can consider as formal ethical frameworks, But there are also informal ethical frameworks that we tend to use quite a lot. In fact, much more than the ethical frameworks. One of them is an intuitive framework, and the second one is a common sense method. The intuitive framework is very straightforward. It asks you to decide on a course of action that, in your view, is intuitively more acceptable. Whereas the common sense method asks you to weigh the available options for action in the light of relevant values. So we have what we can observe informally, what our common sense tells us, or intuitively what we think is the best course of action, but also we have the formal ethical frameworks which helps us weigh different courses of action. The final step then in this evaluation section is to look at what we've had so far. The judgments will not necessarily be the same based on different frameworks. In fact, they can result in different judgments. But it starts to help us make the most morally acceptable decision. At the end of the ethical cycle, we have the final space where we can reflect on what we've done so far and achieve a well-argued choice among the various options for action. So the basic idea is that in the process of reflection, different ethical judgments of a particular moral problem are weighed against each other and brought into some sort of equilibrium. It is understandable and very easy to go with our intuition and common sense. That's what we tend to do, and make a judgment based on that and on personal values and norms and our backgrounds. As we can see in this final step, we are looking at arguing forth and against, pretty much against ourselves, basically forcing us to look at considered judgment critically and eventually achieve a coherence between different layers of the frameworks and reach a solution that may not have been covered by just one framework in isolation. Now, if we go back to the authors of the book that we are reading, they very helpfully give us two sets of questions to test our proposed courses of actions. The first set of questions say that one should ask ourselves, does an ethical framework provide reasons that support my intuitive opinion? If not, do I have any other reasons that support my intuitive opinion? If I have other reasons, are they strong enough to override the ethical framework? And if not, do I really have to revise my intuitive opinion? The second set of questions ask whether an ethical framework succeeded in selecting those features of a situation that are morally relevant. Also, are there any other moral relevant features of a situation that are morally relevant? Are there any other moral relevant features that are not covered? And why are these relevant and how they could be accounted for? Now, following this process will help us arrive to a decision and a judgment that can be argued in relation to different ethical frameworks. The challenge, though, with moral problem solving, however, is that different people can reach different solutions and disagree with our judgment, which can be rather unsettling. It's also normal and expected that you may doubt if you have reached the best morally acceptable decision, particularly if your decisions will affect someone else. And usually for us, our decisions will affect someone else. Therefore, it is good practice to engage in moral deliberations. These deliberations will help when others are involved in helping you achieve a course of action, for example, but also it will help you act in a more morally effective way. Therefore, the reflection step that we've been talking about becomes a provisional step and not necessarily the final judgment of your cycle. The idea of these conversations is to make your reasons for a decision public and expose them to criticism by others. It is important that we actually do that. let's put ourselves out there with our judgments and get the criticism of others so that we are certain that we have reached the best morally acceptable course of action. It will help us revise the judgment if we think that we didn't achieve the best morally acceptable course of action. But maybe you will realize that your arguments were not robust enough, or maybe you had overlooked some of the arguments that you had to consider. Deliberating with stakeholders makes your final judgment more legitimate. On the one hand, because you are respecting their moral autonomy, and that is really important, but also as engineers, we are showing due care to them. So please now refer back to the ethical cycle in your textbook, and thank you for listening.